So I tend to get a lot of questions on drying lumber outdoors like this, and especially since I posted the video on the lumber stack levelers, I got a lot of questions about the foundations for those things, or just the foundations for the stacks in general. So I figured that since I need to get this spot here set up for the big silver maple log that I picked up in my urban logging video, I take you along with that process and answer some questions along the way. So first off is site selection. Where you're gonna put these things, and the ideal place is gonna be in the shade. Putting them in the sun is gonna allow the sun to bake the wood, and it's gonna cause it to dry unevenly. You'll probably end up with more checking and splitting. So in the shade is a better way to go. You have less problems with defects. Now in my case, back here is the shadiest place on my property, and actually my whole property is all shade for the most part. This just happens to be the shadiest spot on it. And try as I did over the years, I cannot get grass to grow back here. It's just way too shady for that. So I never had a lawn back here anyway, so this was the perfect place to put all this stuff because there was no grass to kill anyways. And if I pan up, you can see how much coverage there is over just this one area. So this method of stacking and drying is called the European style. Not really sure why. Maybe you Europeans know. Is this all you guys do over there? Well, one question I get about this is about rain and how that affects the drying and the slabs themselves. For the most part, the rain is kind of covered by this cap piece. So the cap allows the rainwater to get to the outside, and then it'll just cascade down the side over the curvature of the stack of slabs. And some water does get onto the face of the slabs, but that really doesn't make that much of a difference. That ends up just being surface moisture, and just like everything else that it rains on, when it rains, that evaporates and dries within a few hours or whatever after the rainfall has stopped. So rainwater, snow, not really that big of an issue. Any water that gets on the surface is nothing compared to the moisture that's actually contained in the slabs themselves. And the biggest advantage of this method is going to be essentially space utilization. If you don't have a big drying shed, then you can put these things anywhere you have space for them outdoors. Now, another great advantage of drying these outdoors is the availability of the breeze and the wind to pull moisture off the slabs. So if you were to put these into like a garage where the air is stagnant, there's no natural airflow in there, and if you don't have a fan running, for instance, that's going to take a lot longer to dry, and you have a higher risk of mold developing in that case. Out here, the wind's always coming through. Even right now, there's a nice light breeze. So the breeze is providing a nice amount of airflow over the whole stack. So the biggest thing you're trying to do when you're setting up a foundation for either this style stack or any other style stack is to have a nice flat foundation. The idea there is that the foundation will essentially dictate the shape of your final boards. So if you want flat boards, the foundation needs to be flat because the boards will conform to that foundation and hold that shape. So for instance, on this stack back here, if this block here in the middle was higher, this stack would dry with a bit of a hump there or even a bow in the whole board because that board is drying in that shape. Think of it like steam bending. By steam bending, you heat the boards up and you steam them, and then you clamp them to a form, and once the board has dried and cooled, it maintains that shape. Same kind of principle here. The boards will conform to that shape and stay that way. So if I'm just doing a small stack, I'll lay the concrete block down this way with the flat top and bottom. That way I have a lot of bearing surface against the ground and a lot of nice bearing surface on the top for that first sticker. Now the only issue with this orientation you have to consider is if you get a lot of weight and a lot of height on here, if someone comes along or you push the stack on the top a lot, something like that, where there's a lot of force pushing over, these don't have a whole lot of racking support in this orientation. So just imagine this top section moving this way while the bottom stays put. These webs might not be strong enough to resist that, and this thing could collapse. Now, I've never had that happen, but it's something to consider. But for something like this size, where you have one log that's not super big, even though this is like pretty big, it's not really that big of a deal. Just something to consider as you start trying to go higher, like a skyscraper, trying to maximize your square footage. So for this spot, I'll actually be laying out the concrete block in the style I'm using now for my levelers for a lot more weight. It just involves more concrete block and more contact with the ground and the levelers essentially. But I thought I'd walk you through how I would do this style here, where I just have the blocks laying on the ground, and how to get those all laid out and how to get them all in the same plane so you end up with flat lumber. So first I determined what length of lumber I'll be drying so I can get these positioned well, and then I'll space my blocks maybe every 2 feet or so, and I'll do 3 of them here. So that's just 3 blocks, and we're trying to get all the top faces of all 3 blocks into the same plane, so it's flat, there's no high spots, there's no low spots, and there isn't any twist, which is the silent killer. So the easiest way I found to check if they're all in the same plane is to use my extension ladder. This is the same ladder I'd use for the first cuts on my chainsaw mill. So looking at this right now, I have, surprisingly, that's crazy. The first block and the last block are somehow perfect right off the bat. That never happens. Of course it doesn't happen when I'm trying to do this for a demonstration. So let me bring over this other block. With that middle block there, this corner on this block is high, which is throwing off the whole ladder setup. So what I would do, pull this off. This corner here needs to come down. So I just pick up the block and I'd probably just give it a little scrape to bring that level down a little bit and try again. So now that's good all the way across, but you can see here, this side here is low. So I need to bring up this side of this block. So ladder comes off again, block comes out of the way. I grab a shovel, we put some dirt on this side, kind of spread it out a little bit, tamp it down, and that should help raise that backside. Put it back, the ladder again. And it's still low. So I'll do it again. So that is pretty close. And at this point, I'll employ another trick. So I get my first row of stickers on top of the block. I put the ladder back on. So now the ladder is contacting on both the ends. And this one is a hair low on one side and pretty low on the other. So I'll take a shim and put that underneath the sticker to raise it up until it's in contact with the bottom of that ladder. So now at this point, the stack is ready to go. You can pull the ladder off and start stacking. So the downside to this method is it gets a lot more time consuming and a lot more complicated the more blocks you add. 2 or 3 blocks, super easy to get this set up. Start getting to like 6 blocks, it's a lot more time consuming, and that's really what led me to coming up with this whole idea of these levelers. So I'm gonna start getting this area ready for use with these guys. So to get started, I'm gonna do some layout. I know my log is 6.5 feet long, and then the base I'm gonna use for is gonna be 4 feet wide. So I'm just going to align one end with the logs already here, which is pretty much right at the property line, and kind of go from there. So that lays out the extent of my log, and next I need to lay out the locations of the bases, and for this log I'll be using 4 bases. So the first and last base will happen right on the other side of this line, so that the center of that base where that sticker is going to be is about 8 inches from the end of the slab. And the same thing will be happening over here. And then for the middle, I can split the difference. Doesn't need to be super exact. So with everything laid out, and I can start actually getting the base ready. And I am dealing with a slight hill here, so I'm going to be digging out some material on the top side here just to get the actual base closer to level. The base itself, the concrete block, does not need to be level. It just makes it a little bit easier because then the levelers only have so much travel in them. So the closer to level I can get this, the less likelihood there is that my levelers don't run out of leveling travel. So just like when digging for a footing or a foundation, I'm going to leave the earth as undisturbed as possible. That way everything is fully compacted. I don't really have to worry about these things settling over time. So the next thing I'm gonna do is use a straight edge as a screed to make sure this area here is nice and flat or doesn't have a bunch of peaks and valleys in it. If I wasn't trying to take the slope out of this, this is where I would start. I would just start screeding off the ground to get that nice flat surface. And again, this just makes sure that when I put my block down onto this area, that they're not all like undulating and wavy, that they're nice and in a straight line. And now I can lay my block, and this starts off with a course of solid block, and then I'll put my concrete block on top of that. The solid block just provides more bearing surface with the ground. So it's kind of like my other method where I had the blocks turn on their sides to get that much surface area. And since I used the screed to get a nice flat area for these blocks to sit in, these seams are nice and flush and it's not all wavy and goofy. So now I can set the rest of the blocks onto the foundation. So I have a whole block that spans the gap between these solid half blocks on the ground right now. And then a half block on the end. So I also got questions about settling and heaving, and for the most part it's going to depend on the soil conditions of your site. In my case, I deal with the settling issue by not disturbing the soil as much as possible so that it stays fully compacted and I don't have any issues there. Now as far as heaving goes, it's not something I have a whole lot of issue with around here. The soil is extremely sandy, so it drains really well, and it doesn't leave much water in the soil to heave when it does freeze. This whole area actually used to be a potato farm before it was developed into housing. And this stuff is super, super sandy. Another thing to keep in mind with this too is if your foundation pieces are narrower than the width of your slab stack, the slab stack is actually going to shed the water to the outside of the foundation, so not a whole lot of water gets up underneath your blocks. So that'll help as well to keep that moisture away from your foundation. So of course, one of my favorite questions was, why don't you just pour a big slab and be done with it? And if you're okay with that permanency and the expense, definitely go for it. It's going to be a lot easier in the long run. For me personally, I don't plan to be stacking here for enough years to make that investment worth it. And like this, I can really nest things as much as I want. I can expand the area or shrink the area as my needs change. So the foundations are ready to go, so I can put my levelers right on here, get those all set up, and then I can start stacking on top of here. Now of course I'll be using some 4-foot levelers for this stack, and I'm in the process of making some more of those right now. And of course these bases are what is going to adjust for any sort of deviation in all of these rows, because right now they're pretty close, but if I sight down here, I can see that the second one is higher than the first one, and the corner on the third one is higher on one side than the other. So the levelers take care of all that and ensure I have a nice flat foundation no matter what's going on with the actual foundation that's touching the ground. So lastly is, how long do I let this stuff sit out here? And that depends on the species, the thickness, and I guess the overall size. So for this bigger stuff, like what I'm sitting on right here, this is ash, it's 10-quarter, and it's about like 3 feet wide or so. So this stuff I would leave out here until it reaches outdoor equilibrium, which in this case for this stuff is probably going to be about 16 months or so. Now for a thinner piece or something a little bit narrower, it's easier to handle, or I don't mind moving around, I can bring that inside to dry a lot faster at any point. It just depends on how fast I want to use that board and kind of where I am with my indoor drying schedule. If I have some space in there and I feel like carrying some stuff in there from back here, I can pull that stuff in there at any point. So lastly, but for real this time, is insects. Now I'm really lucky where I live here in Minnesota. I get to deal with some really harsh winters, but in exchange for that, I don't have a whole lot of issues with insects. There's not really anything here that would just come up and start eating the wood that's already been cut. Unless the insects were in there to begin with, that's the only time they'd be in the wood. And most things around here, they won't eat or live in wood that is dry or is drying. So just the fact that this stuff is out here drying makes it inhospitable to the insects that might be living in it already when I cut it. Now if you live in an area where you have insect issues, there are a few different things you can do. Of course you can leave it and then kiln dry it to kill them off later, or you can apply a insecticide directly to the surface of the wood, and that'll help prevent stuff from coming into the stack and infecting your stack with insects. So I hope you enjoyed this one and hopefully it answers some of your questions. So thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about anything I talked about today or anything back in the shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.